Hello, everyone. My name's Steven Rodriguez, and I'm going to be going over Assembly Bill 1266 and later going over how that transitioned over into Assembly Bill 179, which was incorporated name changes. So, what we will be discussing, we'll just be briefly going over what is Assembly Bill 1266, when the law went into effect, what does Assembly Bill 1266 provide, and then how that transitioned into Assembly Bill 179, and then how to properly change your name. So, what is Assembly Bill 1266? So, Assembly Bill 1266 is known as the School Success and Opportunity Act. Assembly Bill 1266 was passed on February 22nd, 2013. It was first introduced to ensure that transgender students were protected in educational settings, and it was also created to ensure the same opportunity that these transgender students were also presented with the same opportunities as other students in the school setting. So the assemblyman that created this wanted to make sure that all students had an equal space in athletics and other areas of school. So as I was looking over the California Department of Education that discusses this assembly bill, one of the examples that they gave was a safe space for transgender students to to change and to handle their business in certain areas such as PE or to change after sports meetings. So Assembly Bill 1266 requires that pupils be permitted to participate in sex segregated activities, school programs, and use facilities consistent with gender identity without respect to the gender listed in the pupil's records. So with this being said, if a student wanted to go ahead and use the women's changing room, if they identify as a transgender, they are free to go ahead and do so without having to explain themselves. As I mentioned, this bill was originally put into place because it wanted to create a safe space for transgender students and people in this background. So when the law came into effect, so AB 1266 became a provision within California Education Code on January 14th, 2014. It is important to note that prior to AB 1266, state and federal law permitted gender-based discrimination for some time. So this wasn't something completely new. This kind of just added the fine print and improvised and improved on certain laws and touched on gray areas that may have not been answered. So under federal protection, so Title 11 prohibits sexual harassment and discrimination based on gender or sex stereotypes in every jurisdiction. So discrimination against transgender and gender nonconforming people constitutes sex discrimination. So Title 11 does not typically use the terms transgender or gender identity or expression when describing these people. These rights were clarified by the Board of Education, your colleague letter on October 26, 2010. So as I mentioned, it kind of just took what was already in place and kind of improved and added that fine print to the Assembly Bill. So under California law, state policy states that they must afford all persons in school, regardless of their gender, disability, gender identity, gender expression, nationality, race, or any characteristic that is contained in the definition of hate crimes in section 422.5 of the Penal Code. No person is subjected to discrimination to the previously mentioned. So if you fit any of these categories up top, you are not subject to discrimination within the schooling system. So people are all granted equal opportunities and rights in educational institutions within the state of California. Now, of course, this applies to the state of California. I can't really speak on other states because I only did the research pertain to California, but this all varies from state to state. Um, and I just wanted to go ahead and further add that discrimination against gender identity, or gender expression is also viewed as a hate crime within the state of California. So, what does AB 1266 provide? AB 1266 requires that students be permitted to participate in sex-segregated school programs, activities, facilities, athletic teams, consistent with gender identity, regardless of the gender listed on the pupil's records. Again, so if someone wanted to go ahead that identifies as a male wanted to go ahead and change in the mailroom, they would be allowed to do so regardless of the gender identity that is described on their pupil records. So schools cannot discriminate on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity of the student. Um, this this assembly bill also requires that participation in a particular activity or sport be available to all sexes. So regardless of background, gender identity, sex, you are permitted to participate in a sport of your choosing. And as I mentioned before, Assembly Bill 1266 kind of was the forefather to Assembly Bill 179, which was later kind of even further improving Assembly Bill 1266 and was signed in 2017. So Assembly Bill 179 was signed into law by Governor Jerry Brown in 2017. It ultimately replaced Assembly Bill 1266 and made name changes and gender changes even easier. So beginning in 2019, California law was required to allow non-binary gender identity on their license and other documents issued in the California residence. So this pretty much just made people that identified as transgender or non-binary, it pretty much gave them the opportunity to make it easier in the process of updating their documents. So if they wanted to go ahead and go to a courthouse or change their gender on their ID or others school documents, for example, they would be able to do so. And this assembly bill pretty much made it more accessible and easier for them to do so. In order to do so, the person that wanted to go ahead and change their identity would just have to fill out a petition. And according to Assembly Bill 179, they did not have to attend a hearing in order to change their petition. So changing your name. So in California, you are allowed to change your name and gender. You can see this in the CCP section 1277.5. The person who wants to change their name simply has to fill out the petition. As I mentioned before, the California court will grant your change of name and identity without hearing unless objections are received. So as I mentioned, you could go ahead and fill out this petition for this name change, and the state of California has to grant it to you unless there is objections by any other officials, or if you have a history as to why you cannot change your name, they will ultimately grant you this name change and this gender change. The petition forms to change your name must be accompanied by a physician declaration. So up until 2019, if you wanted to go ahead and fill out this name change and gender change, you had to attach it with a physician declaration. In 2019, Assembly Bill 179 was adjusted, and you no longer had to upload a physician declaration. So if you wanted to go ahead and change your name, you just had to fill out the proper paperwork, the proper petition, and you would just go ahead and submit that. It would take some time for the process to go through. You would not have to attend the hearing, and without the physician declaration, they would go ahead and give it to you. They just had to go ahead and adjust everything through a hearing and with the judge and make sure everything is okay and accurate and up to date. So transgender, the name change process. So changing the name for transgender students or changing identities. So you can prepare the correct set of forms for the courthouse. So that would start off with your petition. You also have to hand in previous forms that include your gender and your name. You would file the forms and get approval. So once you go ahead and submit them, they approve everything, make sure everything is good. Then they would send it to the judge, go ahead and make sure they could change your name. And then you have to ensure that a background check is filed by the courthouse. So the background check is what ultimately may take the longest. And then once the background check is completed, you would go ahead and get approval from the courthouse, and then they would start to begin and switch up your gender, your name on your and all that good stuff on your documentation. So once this is all done, name and gender petitioners are not required to attend their hearing. So once you ultimately get approval, you would begin the process of switching your name. And as I mentioned before, as of 2019, you could also include non-binary on your official documentation. So this is ultimately the steps to go ahead and change your name. And that is it.